There is a filing cabinet in the sub-basement of a civic library on the right bank of the Seine, containing 412 photographic prints from the Great Flood of January 1910. The prints are organized by arrondissement. They are clean, well-preserved, and cited in every major retrospective of the last 60 years. Scholars have called them the most comprehensive visual record of the event. What no retrospective has addressed directly is what the waterline marks on those building facades actually indicate about when the flood reached its peak, and what that timing reveals about the commission that paid to have the photographs made. There is a filing cabinet on the 4th floor of the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris that has not been cited in any published flood retrospective in the last 30 years. It is a standard institutional cabinet, gray-green, the paint along its lower drawer worn to bare metal, where a generation of archivists have nudged it open with their feet. Inside, organized by arrondissement and then by date, are approximately 2,300 individual photographic prints documenting the Great Flood of January 1910. The prints are gelatin silver. Many are in exceptional condition. Some have never been reproduced. What they show and what the official record says about the same days are not, in every detail, the same thing. I was not looking for the flood. That is the first thing worth saying, because the path that leads to something like this is almost never direct. I had spent the better part of 18 months working through the administrative geography of Haussmann-era Paris, specifically the engineering surveys commissioned between 1853 and 1870 that preceded the reconstruction of the city's central sewer infrastructure. My interest was narrow and technical. I wanted to understand how the city's underground drainage network had been mapped, where the survey records lived, and what those records revealed about the relationship between the rebuilt surface city and the much older system of passages, conduits, and vaulted channels running beneath it. That was what I was looking for. The photographs found me while I was looking for something else entirely. The Flood Commission archive came up in a footnote, a secondary reference in a doctoral thesis on pre-war Parisian municipal administration published in 1987, mentioned in passing that the prefectural commission, assembled to document the flood of 1910, had produced a photographic record of considerable administrative thoroughness. The thesis cited no specific holding location. It gave no inventory number. It noted the archive's existence and moved on. I spent 4 months locating it. What I found when I finally sat down with the first drawer of the cabinet was not what the footnote had prepared me for. The commission that authorized the photographic documentation of the flood was formally constituted on the 16th of January 1910, 4 days after the Seine reached its peak height of approximately 8.62 meters above its normal navigable level, according to the gauge at the Pont d'Austerlitz. The commission operated under the authority of the prefect of the Seine and was charged with producing a systematic visual record of flood damage across the city's 20 arrondissements. The stated purpose was administrative and actuarial. The images would support damage assessments, insurance claims, and the eventual report to the national government on infrastructure losses. They were never intended as art. They were never intended as history. They were intended as paperwork, which is perhaps why they survived when so much else did not. The lead photographer assigned to the commission was a man named Gustave Frédéric Morin. He was born in Lyon in 1867 and died in Paris in 1931. He had worked as a commercial photographer since the late 1880s, primarily documenting industrial and municipal subjects, bridges, railway stations, the construction of public buildings. His studio was located in the 14th arrondissement, on a street that no longer exists under the same name. He is not a figure who appears in histories of French photography. He is not listed in any standard biographical dictionary of the period. His name appears in the Commission's founding document, in the payment ledgers, and in the archive itself. His initials, GFM, are stamped in red ink on the verso of each print. Morin brought with him 2 assistants. Their names appear in the Commission's internal work log, which survives in a separate folder within the same cabinet. One assistant is listed as a professional with prior photographic training. The other is listed only by surname, Vaillard, with no first name given, no biographical information, and no other record of professional existence that I have been able to locate in any Parisian administrative archive from the period. Vaillard's name appears in the work log on 7 separate dates, between the 16th of January and the 4th of February 1910. After the 4th of February, it does not appear again. His contribution to the archive, if any prints can be specifically attributed to him, cannot be identified because the prints carry only Morin's initials. The Commission's mandate, as stated in its founding document, was to photograph all 20 arrondissements of Paris, with particular attention to flooded streets, damaged infrastructure, and disrupted commercial and residential properties. That mandate is explicit. It is repeated in the Commission's first progress report, submitted to the prefectural office on the 22nd of January 1910, in which Morin confirms that work is proceeding in systematic order, arrondissement by arrondissement, with no district to be omitted. That phrase, no district to be omitted, is underlined in the original document. I have seen the underlining with my own eyes. Whether Morin underlined it himself or whether a prefectural reviewer added the emphasis later is impossible to determine. The underlining is there. What is also there when you spend enough time with the prints themselves is a question that the archive raises without answering. The Commission's founding document and the Commission's progress report together describe a complete and systematic photographic survey of the flooded city. The archive in the gray-green cabinet is substantial. It is impressive in its scope. For most of the city, it is precisely what those documents describe: thorough, methodical, block by block, and building by building, the water rising in the background of every frame. For most of the city, the record and the physical evidence agree. The question the archive raises is about the parts of the city where they do not. I did not see it in the first drawer. I did not see it in the second. It became visible slowly, the way certain things become visible only when you have been looking at something long enough that the shape of what is missing becomes as legible as the shape of what is present. Morin's prints are organized by arrondissement. Most arrondissements have between 80 and 140 prints. The range is consistent with the Commission's stated method. Most arrondissements tell a coherent visual story of the flood: the water arriving, the water at its height, the water beginning to recede, and finally the streets reappearing, filmed with gray sediment, the damage exposed. Most arrondissements do that, not all of them do. And it was the difference between most and all that kept me returning to that fourth-floor room, to that gray-green cabinet, to Gustave Frederick Morin's red-stamped initials on the back of print after print after print. The record is not false. That is not what I'm saying, and it is important to be precise about what the evidence does and does not support. The record is complete in many of the ways that completeness can be measured. But completeness that is measured only by what is present cannot account for what has been removed, misfiled, or never placed in the cabinet in the first place. The founding document says no district was to be omitted. The archive does not agree. The question the archive raises, what the Commission said it documented and what the cabinet actually contains, did not arrive fully formed. It arrived the way most significant questions arrive when you are working through primary materials. As a feeling of mild arithmetic unease, a sense that the numbers you are encountering do not quite resolve into the total you were led to expect. I set that feeling aside as one does and continued working. I returned to it 3 weeks later when the arithmetic refused to resolve a second time. By the third return, I had stopped setting it aside. The record is not false. That is the oblique truth at the center of everything that follows, and it is worth stating carefully before the evidence complicates it further. The Commission's founding document, its progress reports, its payment ledgers, its internal correspondence, all of these are coherent, internally consistent, and in most respects verifiable against external sources. The archive they describe is largely the archive that exists. The photographs are real, the water was real, the damage was real, and the systematic effort to document it was real. What the record is, rather than false, is selectively complete. It accounts for what it accounts for with considerable thoroughness. It does not account in any document I have examined for what it omits. That distinction between a record that lies and a record that simply does not speak is the distinction that makes this kind of inquiry so difficult to resolve and so difficult to abandon. The man who might have resolved it was named Édouard Théophile Blanchard. He was born in Paris in 1849 in the 8th arrondissement, and he died in Paris in 1933. He was, at the time of the flood, a deputy administrator within the prefectural office. one of 4 officials whose signatures appear on the Commission's founding document. His public record is unambiguous. In the weeks following the flood, Blanchard gave 2 formal interviews to the newspaper Le Temps, one published on the 28th of January 1910 and one on the 9th of February 1910, in which he described the Commission's work in terms of systematic completeness. "We have left nothing undocumented," he told the journalist in the February interview, a statement that was reproduced in the Commission's final report to the national government later that spring. His private correspondence tells a different story, or at least the beginning of one. Among the Blanchard family papers donated to the Archives Nationales in 1967 by his daughter Marguerite, who was born in 1886 and died in 1971. There are 14 letters written by Blanchard between the 17th of January and the 3rd of March 1910. 12 of them concern routine administrative matters. 2 of them do not. The 2 anomalous letters are addressed to a colleague whose name is partially redacted in the Archive's finding aid, a redaction made, according to the catalog notation, at the request of the donating family. In the first letter, dated the 23rd of January, Blanchard writes that the photographic work in one district is proceeding with appropriate discretion. In the second, dated the 11th of February, he writes only that the matter has been resolved to the satisfaction of those with an interest in the matter. No further elaboration, no named recipients, no record of what the matter was. Appropriate discretion is not a phrase that appears anywhere else in the Commission's surviving correspondence. The third named presence in this account is more difficult to locate because, unlike Blanchard, he left almost no documentary trace. The work log inside the cabinet lists him as an assistant on the Commission, surname Vaillard, first name absent, assigned to photographic duties beginning the 16th of January 1910 and last recorded on the 4th of February. Beyond the work log, Vaillard does not appear in the Commission's payment records, which is itself an anomaly. The other 2 assistants received named line entries in the expense ledger. He does not appear in the final report. He does not appear in either of Blanchard's surviving letters. The published Administrative History of the Flood Commission, produced by the Prefectural Office in 1922, lists the Commission's photographic staff by name. Vaillard's name is not among them. Whether this is because he was employed informally, because his records were separated from the main archive at some point, or because his involvement was not something the Commission wished to document formally, is a question the archive does not answer. What the archive does answer, in its own terms, is the question of what a 60-year-old Parisian would have carried into that January. A person who was 60 years old in January of 1910 would have been born in 1849 or 1850. They would have been 21 or 22 years old during the siege of Paris in 1870 and 1871, old enough to have worked, to have made decisions, to have witnessed what the city looked like when it was under military encirclement and then under the violence of the Commune's suppression. They would have been in their late 30s during the Great Flood of 1876, which was less severe than 1910, but significant enough to have left its own marks on the city's infrastructure and collective memory. They would have watched Haussmann's reconstruction transform the physical fabric of the arrondissements they grew up in, would have seen entire streets demolished and rebuilt, entire neighborhoods altered beyond recognition. A 60-year-old in January of 1910 carried 50 years of the city's unwritten history in their body, and no administrative report could replicate what they held. The people who were adults during the flood of 1910, who were 25 or older in January of that year, old enough to hold employment, to own property, to give testimony, were born no later than 1885. The oldest of them, those who were 60 or 70 during the flood, died in the 1930s and 1940s. The youngest of the adult witnesses, those who were in their 20s in 1910, would have been in their 60s and 70s by the time the 1950s ended. By 1960, the generation of Parisians who had stood in floodwater, who had watched the Seine consume the streets of their arrondissements, who had perhaps spoken privately about things the Commission's photographs did not show, was effectively gone. What they knew personally, what they saw with their own eyes, and chose or declined to record, departed with them. This is not a conspiracy. It is how time works on human memory. But it is also how gaps become permanent. The photographs that survive are, in most of the city, exact and comprehensive. They show the water's height on building facades in the form of dark stain lines, The residue left as the Seine receded through late January and into February of 1910. Those stain lines are a secondary archive, involuntary and indelible, a record the water made of itself on stone and plaster without anyone's authorization or discretion. The official timeline, as established in the Commission's final report and corroborated by the gauge readings at the Pont d'Austerlitz, describes when the water peaked and when it began to fall. The stain lines on certain buildings disagree with that timeline, not by days, not by a dramatic and obvious margin. By several hours in January of 1910, as the water moved through the lower arrondissement and into the infrastructure below them, was everything. The stain lines on building facades are not, strictly speaking, part of the Commission's photographic record. They are incidental. They appear in the background of photographs whose stated subject is something else entirely. A collapsed warehouse entrance, a flooded commercial street, a row of sandbags arranged against a doorway in the 7th arrondissement. The photographers were not documenting water levels, they were documenting damage. The water lines are simply there, pressed into the stone and plaster by the slow chemistry of the Seine's sediment, marking the precise height the water reached before it began to fall. They were not made for the record, they were made by the water itself, without authorization, without discretion, and without any interest in what the Commission's final report would eventually say. The Commission's final report, submitted to the national government in the spring of 1910, establishes the flood's peak at the Pont d'Austerlitz gauge as occurring on the 28th of January. The report further states that the water began its measurable recession on the 29th, with significant withdrawal from the lower arrondissements, documented between the 30th of January and the 4th of February. These dates are corroborated by the gauge logs which survive in the Hydraulic Service archives, and by contemporary newspaper reporting which tracked the water's rise and fall with considerable public attention. The official timeline is not a reconstruction. It is documented by multiple independent sources, each recorded at the time, none of them dependent on the Commission's own account. The waterline stains in certain photographs do not correspond to that timeline. The discrepancy is not visible in every print, and it is not dramatic when it appears. It requires close attention to the relationship between the stain height on a given building facade and the known architectural dimensions of the buildings in question. Specifically, the height of ground floor windows, doorway thresholds, and street-level features that can be used to calculate the approximate water depth at the moment the photograph was taken versus the depth the stain line implies the water reached at its maximum. In a subset of prints drawn from the 5th, 6th, and 7th arrondissements, the stain lines indicate a peak water level that is measurably higher than the water visible in any surviving photograph of those streets. The photographs were taken according to the Commission's work log between the 30th of January and the 2nd of February. The stain line suggests the water in those arrondissements peaked not on the 28th of January as the official record states, but later, possibly as late as the 31st or the 1st of February, meaning the water continued rising in those districts even as it was officially receding elsewhere. The official record and the water's own inscription disagree by several hours, in some cases, possibly by more than a day. Several hours is a phrase that may sound like a small thing. In January of 1910, in the lower arrondissements of Paris, as the Seine moved through the underground infrastructure of a city whose sewer and passage systems had been partially rebuilt and partially left in their pre-Haussmann condition, several hours was not a small thing. Several hours determined whether a building's foundation was compromised or merely wetted. Several hours determined what was beneath the water when the Commission's photographers arrived, and what had already been resubmerged or removed. Several hours in an administrative event whose photographic documentation was being conducted simultaneously with the water's own movement could determine what was captured and what was not. Whether this discrepancy was noticed at the time and by whom, and what if anything was done about it, the Commission's surviving records do not say. The first erasure in the archive is not the waterline discrepancy. That discrepancy is something the water made. No human hand placed it there or removed it. The first erasure that bears the shape of a decision rather than an accident concerns a specific arrondissement, the 13th on the left bank of the Seine, southeast of the city's historic center, whose presence in the Commission's administrative record is extensive, and whose presence in the photographic archive is almost non-existent. The 13th arrondissement appears by name in the Commission's founding document, in its first progress report, in its second progress report, and in the final report submitted to the national government. It is listed in all of these documents as having been surveyed and photographed. The final report allocates to the 13th the same administrative attention it gives to every other affected district: damage categories, infrastructure assessments, population displacement estimates. By the administrative record, the 13th arrondissement was documented. The official history of the flood, as established by the Commission itself, includes it without qualification. The photographic archive contains 11 prints that can be reliably attributed to the 13th arrondissement. 11 prints against a mean of 112 prints per arrondissement for the rest of the affected city. The disparity is not a matter of interpretation, it is a count. The official explanation for this disparity, to the extent one has been offered, is logistical. The 13th arrondissement in 1910 contained a number of industrial properties and municipal facilities whose owners or administrators could restrict access during an emergency. It is plausible that the Commission's photographers encountered obstacles there that they did not encounter elsewhere, and that these obstacles reduced the number of prints they were able to produce. Access restrictions are a reasonable explanation for an incomplete photographic record. Reasonable except for one detail in the Commission's own internal correspondence. A memo dated the 2nd of February 1910, written by Blanchard and addressed to the Commission's presiding officer, confirms that the 13th arrondissement had been, in Blanchard's own phrasing, photographed and processed in full. The memo is not ambiguous. It uses the same administrative language employed for every other arrondissement the Commission had completed by that date: photographed and processed in full. The memo does not describe partial coverage, access difficulties, or any administrative obstacle of the kind the logistical explanation requires. It describes a completed body of work. The prints that work produced have never been located in any institutional archive, any private collection, or any secondary source that reproduces flood-era photographs of the 13th arrondissement. The Commission said the work was done. The work, in the form of prints, does not exist. These two facts occupied the same administrative moment, the same week of the same Commission's operation, recorded in the same filing system, authorized by the same signatures. They should be reconcilable. They have never been reconciled, not in 1910, not in the published administrative history of 1922, not in any flood retrospective produced in the century since. The Commission's memo and the archive's silence have existed alongside each other for 114 years, without anyone formally accounting for the distance between them. Not an accident and not yet a pattern, but the distance is real and it has a shape. The second erasure requires a different kind of attention. The first, the missing prints from the 13th arrondissement, is an erasure of presence, an absence where a documented body of work should be. The second is an erasure of geography, something that appears in the photographs that does not appear anywhere in the city's official cartographic record before or after the flood. In a sequence of 14 prints drawn from the area near the Bièvre River channel in the 13th and 5th arrondissements, the Bièvre having been partially covered and partially incorporated into the sewer system during Haussmann's reconstruction, the receding water exposed a section of subterranean infrastructure that runs along what would have been the eastern edge of the old river channel. The infrastructure is visible in the photographs as a series of arched stone openings, partially silted, approximately 2 meters in height, emerging from the flood sediment as the water dropped. Moran's prints document them with the same methodical attention he gave to everything else: multiple angles, consistent framing, the arched openings visible against the surrounding building foundations in at least 7 of the 14 prints. The infrastructure is clearly old. The stonework is consistent with late 18th or early 19th century construction. It is not a sewer access point. It is not a documented drainage conduit. It does not appear on the hydraulic service maps produced by the Prefectural Engineering Office in 1882, in 1897, or in the post-flood infrastructure survey completed in 1911, a survey explicitly commissioned to identify underground damage caused by the water's movement through the city's foundations. The 1911 survey does not mention these openings. It covers the Bièvre corridor in some detail. It does not mention them. The official explanation, to the extent one exists, since no administrative document addresses this specific discrepancy directly, is that undocumented infrastructure is a common feature of Paris's subsurface, particularly in areas that underwent repeated development and redevelopment between the 17th and 19th centuries. This is entirely true. The city's underground is full of passages, chambers, and conduits that were built, sealed, forgotten, and occasionally rediscovered. An arched stone passage visible briefly during a catastrophic flood, subsequently resubmerged by sediment and rising groundwater, and never encountered during routine engineering work, is not inherently suspicious. Old cities contain old things that no one cataloged. That is a reasonable explanation. Reasonable, except for the property records. The arched openings documented in Moran's prints are located based on the surrounding architectural context visible in the photographs, directly beneath or immediately adjacent to 3 parcels of land in the 5th and 13th arrondissements. Those parcels were, in January of 1910, owned or co-administered by 3 individuals. Henri Casimir Rouvière, born in Paris in 1852 and died in Paris in 1948. Louis-Philippe Després, born in Lyon in 1858 and died in Paris in 1946. And a third figure identified in the Commission's founding document only as a senior advisor, whose full name appears as Marcel Édouard Fontaine, born in 1861, died in Paris in 1949. All 3 are listed as members of the Commission's presiding body. All 3 signed the founding document. All 3, in their capacity as Commission overseers, would have reviewed Moran's photographic work as it was produced and processed. Rouvière, Després, and Fontaine were reviewing photographs that documented something directly beneath land they owned or administered. At the same time, they were responsible for determining which of those photographs entered the official archive and which did not. The word simultaneously is worth pausing on because the Commission's work log makes the simultaneity explicit. Moran submitted prints for review in batches, organized by arrondissement. The batch containing the Bièvre corridor prints was submitted for review on the 5th of February 1910, according to the work log's entry for that date. The Commission's review notation for that batch, a brief administrative record of which prints were approved for the archive and which were set aside for supplementary filing, is dated the 7th of February 1910. The 14 prints documenting the arched stone openings are listed in the supplementary filing notation, not in the approved archive. They appear in the cabinet today not because they were approved for the main archive, but because they were never removed from the submission batch before the batch was filed. They survived by administrative oversight, not by institutional intention. Within the same administrative period, the Commission approved for inclusion prints from every other arrondissement while directing the Bièvre corridor documentation into a category that was, in practice, a holding area for materials that were not to be formally archived. The Commission's own notation called it supplementary. The 14 prints that documented the infrastructure beneath Rouvière's, Després, and Fontaine's properties sat in that holding area for decades. The third erasure is the one that required the longest time to understand, because its mechanism is not absence or misdirection, but displacement, a movement of the archive itself that the official explanation renders innocent, and that a single date makes difficult to accept as such. The Moran archive, the full cabinet, the complete submission batch, the payment ledgers, and work logs disappears from the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris's institutional acquisition records between 1942 and 1958. The acquisition record that documents its presence prior to 1942 is a 1937 catalog entry. The acquisition record that documents its current holding is a 1958 re-cataloging entry, produced when the archive was located in its current room on the 4th floor. Between those 2 dates, a span of 16 years, the archive has no documented location. The official explanation is wartime displacement. The occupying administration's requisitioning of municipal buildings during the years 1940 to 1944 caused extensive disruption to the city's archival holdings, and many collections were moved, mislaid, or temporarily lost during that period. This is historically accurate. The disruption to Parisian institutional archives during the occupation was significant and well documented. Wartime displacement is a reasonable account of how a photographic cabinet might vanish from institutional records for 16 years. Reasonable, except for the room in which the cabinet was found. The 4th floor room at the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris, where the cabinet currently sits, was constructed as part of a building expansion completed in 1949. The room did not exist before 1949. The archive could not have been displaced there by wartime disruption because the space it now occupies did not exist during the war. It was placed in that room after the room was built, by someone with access to both the archive and the newly completed building at some point between 1949 and 1958, the year the re-cataloging entry formally reintegrates it into the institutional record. The archive was not displaced to its current location. It was delivered there. Deliberately after the war, by a hand the institution has never identified and no administrative record names. Each of these facts is, individually, a detail. A missing batch of prints explained by a supplementary filing notation, an undocumented passage beneath privately held land, a cabinet moved during a period of institutional disruption to a room that was built after the disruption ended, each step plausible on its own. Together they describe something the official record does not. There are 3 men whose deaths close the evidentiary record in a way that the archive itself cannot explain. Henri Casimir Rouvière died in Paris in 1948. He was 96 years old. His death was recorded by the civil registry of the 8th arrondissement, and a cause of death is noted: cardiac failure, consistent with his age. Louis-Félix Desprez died in Paris in 1946. He was 88. His death was also recorded by the civil registry, and a cause is listed: respiratory complications, likewise consistent with his age, and the conditions of the post-war period in a city still recovering from occupation and scarcity. These 2 deaths, taken individually, require no explanation beyond the ordinary arithmetic of human lifespans. 2 elderly men, both in their late 80s and 90s, dying in the years immediately following the war. Nothing about those facts on their own demands attention. Marcel-Édouard Fontaine died in Paris in 1949. He was 88 years old. No cause of death is recorded in his civil registry entry. The line where a cause would appear is blank, not illegible, not damaged, not obscured by age or poor preservation. Blank. The registry entry is otherwise complete: date, location, attending notary, next of kin. The cause line is simply empty, as though the form were filled out by someone who either did not know or did not choose to say. 3 men: Rouvière in 1946, Desprez in 1946, Rouvière in 1948, Fontaine in 1949, a span of 36 months. All 3 had been members of the Commission's presiding body in January of 1910. All 3 had reviewed Morin's photographs. All 3 owned or administered property above the arch stone infrastructure the Commission's supplementary filing had quietly absorbed. All 3 were, at the time of their deaths, among the last surviving individuals with direct administrative knowledge of what the Commission had documented, what it had filed separately, and what, if the Blanchard letters mean what they appear to mean, had been resolved to the satisfaction of those with an interest in the matter. None of them left a published statement about the Commission. None of them gave a recorded interview about the flood. None of them, in any document that has surfaced in any archive accessible to independent inquiry, addressed the 13-to-1 disparity between the photographic coverage of the 13th arrondissement and every other district in the city. They lived long enough to have said something. They did not. This is the shape of the 4th erasure: not a document destroyed, not a photograph removed, not a cabinet moved to a room that did not yet exist. The 4th erasure is the silence of the people who knew, sustained across 4 decades and terminated by 3 deaths inside 36 months, 2 of them with causes recorded and 1 of them without. Now the sequence in full. The 12th of January 1910, the Seine begins its rise. The 16th of January 1910, the Prefectural Commission is formally constituted. Morin, his 2 assistants, and 4 presiding officials, including Blanchard, Rouvière, Desprez, and Fontaine, are named. The 23rd of January 1910, Blanchard writes privately that work in one district is proceeding with appropriate discretion. The 28th of January 1910, the Seine reaches its official peak at the Pont d'Austerlitz gauge. The 30th of January through the 2nd of February 1910, Morin photographs the Bièvre corridor. The arched infrastructure is documented in 14 prints. The 5th of February 1910, the Bièvre corridor batch is submitted for commission review. The 7th of February 1910, the batch is reviewed. 14 prints are directed to supplementary filing. The 11th of February 1910, Blanchard writes that the matter has been resolved. The spring of 1910, the Commission's final report is submitted. The 13th arrondissement is listed as fully documented. The report states no district was omitted. 1922. The Prefectural Office publishes its administrative history of the flood. The photographic record is described as complete. Villard's name does not appear. 1937, the Morin archive is catalogued at the Bibliothèque historique de la Ville de Paris, 1940 to 1944. The occupation, archival disruption across municipal institutions. 1946, Després dies, no anomaly recorded. 1948, Rouvière dies, no anomaly recorded. 1949, the fourth floor expansion of the Bibliothèque historique de la Ville de Paris is completed. Fontaine dies, no cause recorded. 1958, the Morin archive is recatalogued in its current location in the room built 9 years after the war ended. 1967, Blanchard's private correspondence is donated to the Archives Nationales by his daughter. 2 letters are noted but not reproduced in the finding aid. Their recipients remain partially redacted at the family's request. Each step documented, each step in isolation accountable. The record was not falsified, it was shaped. There is a photograph in the 3rd drawer of the gray-green cabinet filed under the Bièvre corridor batch, stamped on its verso with Morin's red initials. It shows a flooded alleyway in what the surrounding architecture identifies as the lower 5th arrondissement. In the foreground, flood sediment has settled across the paving stones in a pale, even layer, the texture of it almost soft in the gelatin silver print. In the middle distance, partially obscured by the angle of the photograph and the depth of field Morin was working with, 2 of the arched stone openings are visible. The water has receded enough to expose their upper sections. They are darker than the surrounding stonework, filmed with the same sediment that covers the street, but their shape is legible, rounded, substantial, the work of skilled masons operating well before the photographic era. They were built by hands that could not have imagined that a camera would one day record them. They were directed into a supplementary file by hands that understood exactly what the camera had done. The question the archive raises, the one planted in the founding document, sustained through the progress reports, and made strange by the Commission's own internal correspondence, is not whether the record is false. The question is who decided what the record would contain, and at what cost to what was left outside it. That question has not been answered by any document in any archive accessible to independent research. It has also not been foreclosed by any of them. The stain lines on the building facades in the 5th, 6th, and 7th arrondissements still disagree with the official timeline by several hours. The arched openings in Morin's supplementary prints were never mapped. The cabinet was delivered after the war to a room that did not exist during the war. Blanchard's letters survive. Fontaine's death certificate has a blank line where a cause should be. Not a conspiracy, precisely. Something quieter and in some ways more durable. The last person known to have given a recorded account of the Flood Commission's operations while holding personal knowledge of its internal proceedings was a woman named Céleste Marguerite Aubert. She was born in Paris in 1873, in the 11th arrondissement, the daughter of a municipal clerk who worked in the prefectural office's administrative correspondence division. She died in Paris in 1964 at the age of 91. In January of 1910, she was 36 years old, employed as a senior administrative secretary within the prefectural office, and she is named in 3 of the Commission's internal documents as having prepared correspondence on behalf of Blanchard and the Commission's presiding officers. She was not a decision maker. She was the person who typed the decisions, who sealed the envelopes, who organized the filing of the documents that now survive, partially in the gray-green cabinet and in the Blanchard family papers at the Archives Nationales. In 1961, 3 years before her death, Aubert gave a brief recorded interview to a private researcher whose identity is noted in the archive's secondary documentation only as a doctoral candidate at the University of Paris. The interview was not published. A transcript, 3 pages in length, survives in the possession of an individual whose name I have not been able to establish, referenced in a footnote of a 1978 dissertation on administrative practices during the Third Republic. The footnote describes Aubert as stating in her own words that the Commission kept 2 kinds of records, those made for reading and those made for keeping. She elaborated only that this was the ordinary practice of any serious office, and declined to specify further. The doctoral candidate apparently pressed her on the point. Her response, as transcribed, was, "What the water left behind is still there. It always is. You simply have to know where to look." She died 3 years later. The transcript has not been reproduced in any subsequent publication. The dissertation that cited it is held in 1 library copy at the University of Paris. The flood is not the subject of this account. The Commission is not the villain of it. What happened in January of 1910, the water rising through the streets of a city of 2,800,000 people, the Seine consuming the lower arrondissements, the extraordinary administrative effort to document and quantify the damage. All of that happened as the official record describes it in most of its particulars, with most of its thoroughness intact. The record is not a fabrication. It is the work of a functioning institution doing what institutions do, recording, categorizing, and preserving what it determined to be worth preserving. The record reflects the city the Commission wanted documented. It also, unavoidably, reflects what the Commission preferred not to document in the same detail, in the same depth, or at all. Whether any of this was coordinated, whether Blanchard's letters and the supplementary filing notation and the blank cause of death line on Fontaine's registry entry are connected by intention rather than by coincidence and institutional inertia, cannot be established by the documents that survive. That connection has not been proven. It has also, in the 114 years since the Seine receded from the streets of the 5th and 13th arrondissements, never been disproven. The archive contains what it contains. The questions it raises have not been answered by any subsequent investigation, because no subsequent investigation, to the best of my knowledge, has been conducted by anyone with access to all of the relevant materials simultaneously. The cabinet, the Blanchard correspondence, the Commission's work log, the civil registry entries, and the 1958 recataloguing notation that places the archive in a room built 9 years after the war it was supposedly displaced by. Each anomaly, addressed alone, resolves into something manageable. Incomplete photographic coverage of 1 arrondissement, explained by access difficulties. Undocumented underground infrastructure, explained by the age and complexity of the city's subsurface. An archive displaced during wartime and relocated afterward, explained by the ordinary administrative disruption of occupation. 3 elderly men dying within 36 months of each other, explained by the actuarial arithmetic of advanced age. A blank cause of death line on a single civil registry entry, explained by clerical omission. Blanchard's phrase, appropriate discretion, explained as bureaucratic caution of the kind any administrator might exercise. An archive delivered to a post-war room, explained as a practical decision made by an unnamed archivist with access to newly available space. Each of those explanations is plausible. None of them is impossible. Together, they describe a record that required, at multiple points across 4 decades, exactly the kind of quiet management that leaves traces too small to constitute evidence and too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. The photograph in the 3rd drawer of the gray-green cabinet, the one filed under the Bièvre corridor batch, stamped with Moran's red initials, showing the flooded alleyway with the arched stone openings partially visible in the middle distance, has not been reclassified since the archive's recataloguing in 1958. It has not been reproduced in any flood retrospective published since that year. It has not been cited by any historian of Parisian infrastructure, any architectural historian of the Pré-Haussmann Underground, or any scholar of the 1910 flood whose published work I have been able to locate and examine. The print is in good condition. The gelatin silver surface is stable. The arched openings are clearly visible to anyone who looks at the photograph with knowledge of what they are looking at and why they were directed, in February of 1910, away from the main archive and into a supplementary file from which they were never formally retrieved. The cabinet sits in its 4th floor room. The paint on its lower drawer is worn to bare metal. The prints inside are organized by arrondissement and then by date, exactly as they were when I first opened it, exactly as they have been since 1958, or since whenever before that an unnamed person placed them in a room that had not yet existed when the flood they document finally receded from the streets of Paris. Aubert said the water leaves things behind. She said they are always there if you know where to look. The photograph remembers. The record does not.